this chapter, we're talking about something about these features or the basic ideas of Java programming language. So first, something about the variables. The variable is the item of the data. That the item is located inside the memory. So inside the memory of our computer, we have an item. In this item, we can put data into this item, or we'll get data from it. So it's very important for us, the variables, we can store data and get data from it. Inside our programming language, the variable is a very important item for us. How to define it, the variables. Here's the format. The declaration format for the variables. We write the variable declaration as this. The left side is a type of the variable. The right side is the name of the variable. Between them is a space. So here's some examples. Now we define a variable named as largest byte, and its type is byte. And once we declare a variable, then we can use assignment operator to assign the actual value to this variable. Here we assign a value as the maximum value of a byte type data, 127 and decimal format. We assign a value to this largest byte. And another example. Now define a character variable named as a character and assign a letter S, the big S, to this variable. And then we have Boolean. The Boolean variable, we define a variable name as a Boolean and assign only two kinds of value we can assign to this, the true or false. Now we assign the true value to this variable a Boolean. This is how to define a variable. This is a format. Okay, we must remember the format when we do my coding work. And here we have two kind of variables. The primitive, this is first kind of the variable, and the reference variable, the second type of variable. Now we look at the first type of the variables. The primitive variables contains a single value of appropriate size and the format of this type. For example, a number, or a character, or the Boolean value. So if we want to store data information into a variable, we should choose the primitive type. Now in Java, we have this kind of primitive data type, the integers, real numbers, or characters, and the Booleans, but four kinds of different primitive data type. The integers, the real numbers, the characters, and the Boolean. Well, the first type, integers, they are byte and a short and an int and the long. And the byte, short, or int, or long integer type, They are all signed value. The signed value means it must be positive or negative number to define use this type of variable. This is signed value. But unsigned value means we only can have a number that is positive number or zero, no negative number. But signed number allow us to use the negative number. That's the difference between the signed and unsigned data. But in Java, only the signed number are supported in this language. And these four kinds of different integer numbers that have different size. The byte size has 8-bit and short size has 16-bit. The 16-bit means 2 bytes. 1 byte we have 8-bit, so this 1 byte and short and 2 bytes, and int variable we have 32-bit, means we have 4 bytes, and a long type is 64-bit, means we have 8 bytes. Yeah, so it's different. How to choose the suitable one depend on your coding, the size of your data. If you need a big size for your data, you should use int or long type. Okay, that is the integers. And the real numbers, we have two kinds of real numbers: the float, 32-bit, and a double is 64-bit. They are all the IEEE 754 format, the standard format. And we have characters and booleans. The characters, we use this Unicode coding format. And this characters, so we use this type of variable to store the character, such as letters. For example, this letters big A or small a, or other symbols. For example, this symbol or this symbol or this symbol. But we can use this type of variable to store these symbols. Here is a character, and that's a boolean. The boolean means we use this variable to present the true or false. So we use the boolean variable to store the true or false, the state, into its boolean value. One point, and a very important point for this variable, that is the variable, the date type, they are not dependent on the page form. So it is not dependent on this page form means a different operating system or different hardware platform, this data type, they keep the same size. For example, int variable on different kinds of operating system, they're always the same size, the 4 bytes. They are the same. This is very important for programmer because they keep the same size. The reason that they could remain the same size is that the Java program language is only for the JVM, not for the platform, because on different kinds of operating system, we all deploy the JVM on them. So to our programmer, we have the same virtual machine. So we have same size for our variables. Okay, this is ideal. And once we define a primitive type of variable, now we can assign different value to them. The variable, we have the name for it as natural values. Natural values have different type, depends on different type of primitive variables. For example, if I want to assign the literal value to an int variable, now we should write as, for example, 178 to an int variable. And we want to assign a known integer type value to a known variable. How to write it? We should add a postfix as a big L. The big L at the end of the data. Here is 8864. The big L at the end of the data. So this is the literal value, and we assign it to a long variable. Be sure you should use the big L, not the small l. Why? Because on our computer, our screen, the small l, this letter, is similar with the number 1. So the small l and the number 1, you may, if and not be careful, you may confuse with them. Well, this small l or this the number 1, well, it make you confusing sometimes. So in Java program language specification, it will command for us that we should use a big L as a postfix to write literal values. Okay, that's the same idea. So we use the big D to define a double variable, and we use the big F to define float variable. Okay, that's the same idea. And we want to write a literal value for a character variable. We should use the quotation mark, and inside we put a letter into it. Here's a C. This is letter. Another format to assign the literal value to characters is using the Unicode. If I want to use Unicode, for example, here's a big C. If I want to use Unicode, the same as we use slash, and we put U letter, and this Unicode is 16-bit, so we okay, 0043. Well, it is Unicode. It is the same as we use the big C with quotation mark. It's the same. And if we Boolean, if we assign a literal value to Boolean, so use only 2 values are now to assign to the Boolean. 2 literal values is allowed. That is true or false. Okay. This is about the first type of the value, that is primitive. Another type of value we name as reference. So about the reference type, the reference variable, what its purpose for? The reference variable is used to store a reference address. We name it address. Using the address, we can access the objects inside of memories. The objects is arrays or other kind of objects, which is created from the class or interface. So reference variable inside Java programming language is very important. We can use them to access variables, and this variable as a specific variable. That because it's objects, we use reference variable to access objects inside memories. So reference variable here is the similar as the pointer variable in other languages. In C or C++ language, you may learn something about a pointer, this kind of variable, that inside the pointer we have address. So we use this address to access the location, accesses the items inside the memories at its address. It may be a integer value or a character or a function or something else in C languages. So we use pointer, this kind of variables. But in Java, we don't have this kind of variables. Instead, we have reference variable. That's different. Actually, the reference variable, inside the reference variable, we have address. For example, here is memory, and inside the memory, we have object. The object's address may be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 32-bit address. So the reference variable, we put this address inside it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So inside the reference variable, we have this address. So we can use the reference variable to access, to read, or write to object inside the memory at the address. So at this point, the reference variable and the pointer variable in the C language are the same. They both address. They're the same. But the difference between them is the reference variable inside Java and the pointer variable inside C or C++. The difference between them is the reference variable inside Java is a symbol address. It's a symbol address. It's not a numeral address. That means the reference variable, we don't know the actual address stored inside this variable because this address is assigned to this variable automatically by statements. When we create the object inside the memory and we use the reference variable to access them, to build connection between the reference variable and this object, we use the statement. We were talking about this statement in the fourth chapter, how to create a reference variable and use it to access the object. And in this statement, once this statement is executed by JVM, an address will automatically get address in the object and put it in the reference variable. So we don't know the actual address. We can't assign the actual address directly to the reference variable in Java. But in C or C++, we can. Yeah. If you have address, you can assign address directly to a pointer variable and use this pointer to access the place you want. So it's not a symbol address, it's a numeric address. So this is different. Because of this, so the reference variable, we can't make arithmetic operation on them. But the pointer variable, we can. We can use that, increase them or decrease them because the number, so we can to change them directly use some kind of arithmetic operations. Okay, so that's different between the reference variable and this in Java and this point variable in C or C++. Okay. Well, this is about two kinds of variables, a primitive type and a reference type. They have different use in our coding. And we use primitive data variable to store the numbers, the characters, or other kind of things, and we use reference variable to access objects inside the memory. Now these have different how to name these variables. We have two kinds of name. One is a sample name, another is a qualified name, a different name. And qualified name we were talking about in the maybe the fourth next chapter. But we're talking about the qualified name. We use a qualified name to access object. And a sample name, we define a sample name inside a class, inside object. We use sample name, and we use qualified name to access an object. Use reference variable. Now, in Java programming language, about a sample name, they have some rules to define a sample name. Here's someone. The first, it must be a legal identifier. What legal identifier means? You can use the Unicode characters, but it must begin with a letter. You can define a name begin with a number. It's not a noun. Okay. And second, the simple name, you cannot use a keyword inside Java to add a sample name. For example, you use int. That is the keyword because it's a type. You cannot and not use this name, the int, as the sample name. Well, the true or false because they are literal value for the Boolean variable, so they cannot use as the name for your variables or other received word. Okay, the second rule. And the third, it's important, it must be unique within its scope. That means you cannot and not use the same name for a variable because if the same scope, if the same scope, you define two variables with the same name, that is not allowed. You must have a unique name within the scope. But if a different scope, here is one scope as another scope here, and this variable A and variable B, they can have the same name as A. It's okay. But inside one scope, they must have different name. But different scope, you can't have the same name. That's the idea about variable names. Now, talking about some about scope. A variable scope means the region of the program, and within this region, which variable can refer to by this sample name. That means, in other words, we have a region. We have a area. Inside this area, inside the region, we can access a variable, but outside the region, it's not allowed to access this variable. That it's a scope. That's a scope means. Okay. Now we have four kinds of different scope. The needs that's here. The member variable scope, the local variable scope, the method, parameter, scope, and the net scope. Okay. What does scopes mean? The member variable scope means here we have the diagram. It's a class, name my class, and inside class body we define the member variable here between the left bracket and the right bracket. The class body inside the class body, that's a member variable scope. Well, it's a member variable scope. Okay, that is yellow region. It's for the member variable. And local variable, the second one is local variable. Local variable means we define a variable inside a, a code block. For example, inside code block, we define a local variable. Here we define it. Yes, this one, this region for this local variable. Yes, that means inside this area, inside the region, inside this code block, we can access a local variable. But outside this area, it is not allowed. It's about a local variable. And the third one is parameters. The parameters means here we have the parameter for a method with parameter. The parameters, the scope, it's inside the methods. From the left bracket to the right bracket, it's a method body, and the method body is a region that is variable to access for these parameters. And the next one is exception handler parameter. Exception handler parameter, here we have the exception. About as a section, this concept, we are talking about it in the 7th chapter. Okay, now it's the same as method parameter. The difference is this catch handler. Inside the handler, this is white. It's a white body. Inside white color body, we use as area, as a region. We can access the scope for this exception handler parameters. Well, this is a 4. So we have 4 kinds of scopes: member variables, local variables, method parameters, or exception handler parameters. Okay, that's about the scope. Here's an example for the scope. Now we define a variable inside a code block. This if and it's a code block. Inside code block between the brackets, we have defined a local variable named I. It's a primitive variable, integer, and set value 17 to this variable, and this variable is local variable. So it's local variable. How about its scope? We're talking the local variable is if we define a local variable inside a code block. So its access scope is this code block. So the code block is, well, here's the code block. Begin and the end. So this code block. So outside this code block, we cannot access this variable anymore. Then, now outside this code block, we have statements. Inside the statements, we know all the statements is print out this string to a screen. Inside this statement, we use the variable I, but because now we are outside the code block, inside code block we define this variable I, but outside code block we won't use it. It's not allowed. It's outside the region, outside the scope of the local variable. So if we use this statement, we will get the error. Okay, that's about the scope. Next is about how to initialize the variable. Which means the variable initialization. Okay, the initialized operation is very simple. We use a assign operator to do this job, to assign a value to the variables. For example, now we have largest integer. It's a primitive number, and we assigned a number integer, the maximum value to this, not just integer. We use this assignment operator. At the same, we assign a big S to a character. It's a character type, the primitive type of the characters. And we assign a true to a boolean. It's the same. Okay? But the parameters and exception handler parameters do not use these assignment operators. They use the method corner. For example, now we have a method, I mean the X method, and the max method, we have the parameters, for example, is int A and int B. Well, now it's a method defining one of the object. How to use this method, how to assign the value to A and B. So we use a corner. In the future, if this method will inside a class named as, for example, named as A, and in the future we got the reference variable which you can use this access A class, and then we will use a qualified name A. This is A. It says A is a reference variable, and it use X method. It's a method name. This is corner. How to use this method inside the object, and use the and pass the actual number, the native number to it. For example, 1 and 2. Here's a corner. Now there's 1 and there's 2. There's the natural number. We pass them to the variable A and the variable B. So we use a corner to pass, to initialize this variable inside the methods. This example. And one very important concept about this variable initialization is that the default assignment. The default assignment means if we have a member variable, yes, a member variable, remember, a member variable is defined inside a class. It's instance variable. So if we have the member variables, we have defined it inside a class, but we forget, for example, we forgot to initialize it for some reason. Well, so if we forget to assign some value to them, that means initialization will forget the initialization for these member variables. How does JVM do? Okay, they will assign a default value to them automatically. So if I have the member variable, if this type is int, the system will assign the 0 to it. If this character, we assign the, here's the Unicode type of the character's natural value to it. And if it's a reference variable, well, it's a reference variable. Now we can, oh yeah, reference variable. For example, the string, we will say now to it. If it's a boolean, there's false to it. It's automatically. These are the default values for these member variables. But remember, only member variables can be assigned default values if you forget to initialize them. But if you define a local variable, but you forget to initialize it after define it, it cannot be assigned the defaults. And then what happens? You will get an error if I want to use it, but before you use it, you haven't assigned any number to it. You will get an error because the system, well, they were not to assign a default to them because they are not the member variables, they are local variables. So this is very important. So you must remember, if you define local variables, be sure to initialize it before using. Okay, this is about the variable initialization, the default assignments. Now this is the final. The final variables means if we want to do some constant in our code, we have variables. It means we can change these variables. So these variables. But in some case, in some situation, want to find a number that will not be changed. So it's a constant. How to define constant inside Java? We use final variables. It means we want to define a constant inside a constant. Yeah, inside the code, use final variables. Yeah, simply you put a final this keyword at the beginning of this definition. We add the final as a prefix, and the final, and then space, and then this is a declaration of the variables. So the blank final now, because we have a final at the beginning of it, so it became a constant. The constant means we can give it a number, and once we have assigned a number to it, it becomes constant. So we cannot assign another value to it again. So it's constant. It kept unchanged during the whole code. Once we define it and assign it, I will not allow to assign a new value to it again. It's become a constant. We use a final variable to define a constant.